My own son told me I would never be on TV, and the very day a producer finally called with the chance of a lifetime, he picked up the phone before I could even reach it, and with a calmness that still chills me, he said into the receiver, "She's not interested," then hung up as if he had done me a favor, and in that single moment I realized betrayal can taste more bitter than any burnt dish. If you have ever felt the sting of someone close to you crushing your dream just when you were about to rise, I'd be so grateful if you hit that like button or left a comment, because your support reminds me that sharing these stories matters, and it helps me keep telling the truth when silence would be easier. I'm Denise Carter. I'm 55 years old. I've spent my life at the stove stirring pots of gumbo and cornbread with the same hands that once braided my baby's hair and wiped his tears. And for years I carried the belief that one day my food could travel farther than my block, that women like me could be seen not as background voices, but as the main story. For so long I sat at the same scratched kitchen table, pushing envelopes across its surface as if I were sliding pieces of my soul into the world, writing letters to food networks and producers, entering recipe contests with the hope that one set of eyes would see me. And every time a rejection came back with words like not the right fit or lacking appeal, I reminded myself that persistence was the one spice I could never run out of. So I kept trying, even when the weight of disappointment pressed down on my shoulders like cast iron. Malik would smirk when I filmed myself on an old camcorder, mocking my apron like I was a child playing dress-up. And though it stung, I told myself mothers endure. Mothers keep cooking no matter who laughs, but nothing prepared me for the cruelty of that phone call, the very one I had been praying for, silenced before I even knew it rang. He didn't just cut off a producer, he cut off years of work, years of waiting, years of whispered prayers, and the worst part was the satisfaction in his eyes, as if he wanted me to stay small, as if my rising threatened him. That night after the call, I sat at the same table again, staring at the phone as though it had turned into a weapon in my own house. And I tried to make sense of the boy I raised becoming the man who stole my chance. And I thought of all the sacrifices I had made, of all the nights I worked late shifts to pay for his school, of the meals I stretched out of scraps so he would never go hungry, and I couldn't help but laugh through the tears at the absurdity. Because it felt like life had played the cruelest joke of all, one where the punchline was my own son standing between me and the dream I had built my life around. The rejection letters had been cruel, but at least they came from strangers who owed me nothing, while Malik's betrayal cut in a way that left no bandage. Because when your child tells you with his actions that your voice doesn't matter, it shakes you more than any stranger's no ever could. I wanted to believe he was misguided, that he thought he was sparing me humiliation. But the smirk on his face told the truth, and mothers may forgive, but we are not blind. I lay awake that night hearing the silence of my kitchen like it was mocking me. The same silence I had fought against for years when no producer answered. But this time it was darker, heavier, and it carried a weight that made me realize I wasn't just fighting the world. I was fighting inside my own home. I didn't know it then, but this was only the beginning, because that phone call was more than a lost opportunity. It was the first sign that my own blood was willing to stand in my way. And as I would soon discover, even the police were afraid to step into the shadows Malik's choices created. What started as rejection would soon grow into sabotage, and the kitchen that had once been my safe haven was about to turn into a battlefield. But in that moment, all I could do was swallow the bitterness, sit with the sting of betrayal, and hold on to the smallest ember of faith that somehow, some way, the truth would find a way back to me. At first, I tried to tell myself that losing the call was the worst of it, that nothing could sting more than knowing opportunity had slipped through my fingers in my own kitchen. But life seemed determined to prove me wrong, and what began as one betrayal soon grew into a string of small humiliations that piled up until they felt unbearable. Letters I mailed never reached their destinations. Neighbors who once asked for seconds of my food suddenly looked away when I waved, And somehow, every tool I needed broke down right at the moment I needed it most. Mixers clattering into silence, ovens refusing to heat, as if even the appliances in my house had joined the conspiracy. I swallowed my anger and told myself to keep going, but each day it felt like the walls were tightening and the air itself turned heavy, pressing down on me like a pot lid I could not lift. The gossip spread like wildfire through church pews and grocery aisles, whispers dressed as concern that my kitchen wasn't clean, that maybe my food made people sick, that perhaps I had stolen my own recipes from somewhere else. And though the words were ridiculous, they still cut deep because they carried the tone of truth when repeated enough. What made it worse was watching Malik stand by with a smirk, offering little shrugs as if to say, maybe people just didn't believe in me, when I knew in my heart those lies had his fingerprints all over them. Even the local officer who once praised my peach cobbler now crossed the street to avoid me, and his silence said more than words. Because when men in uniform look away, you know fear has already been bought and paid for. I tried to brush it off with humor the way I always had, joking to my friend Loretta that if I really ran a shady kitchen empire like the rumors said, at least I should be making more money than I had in my worn-out purse. She laughed and told me I ought to start charging extra for gossip seasoning, since clearly everyone in town was hungry for it, but when the laughter faded, the reality still sat heavy in my chest. It wasn't just talk anymore. It was a campaign to erase me, to make sure no producer, no customer, no neighbor would ever trust my name again. And the cruelest part was realizing the boy I raised was standing behind it, trading my reputation for the cheap respect of men who never lifted a spoon in their lives. At night, when I tried to rest, I replayed each moment like a broken record, the ruined equipment, the lost invitations, the wary stares, and I told myself maybe it was just a season. Maybe the storm would pass. But in the pit of my stomach, I knew storms like this don't move on their own. They have to be broken apart by lightning. I didn't know when or how, but I felt the spark beginning to build inside me, tiny at first, like the faint smell of gas before a burner catches. And I promised myself that the fire they thought they had smothered was still alive under the ashes, and soon enough, something would ignite it. The weeks that followed felt like standing barefoot on broken glass, every step forward cutting deeper than the last, and just when I thought I had adjusted to the sting, another shard appeared underfoot. The whispers that began as gossip turned into full-blown rumors spoken with certainty. Women at the salon shaking their heads as though they pitied me, men at the market whispering that I cut corners in my kitchen. And even the choir director once asked me quietly if I should stop cooking for church events until things cleared up, as if my name had become some kind of stain. It was humiliating in a way I had never known, because it wasn't rejection from strangers anymore. It was mistrust from people who had eaten at my table, people who had once licked their fingers and asked for my recipes. The sabotage moved from whispers to action, sharp and deliberate, like a thief who doesn't just take your purse, but slashes it open so you know you've been robbed. Boxes of my labels disappeared right before I needed them, replaced by cheap imitations plastered on food carts I'd never seen before, carts that served dishes suspiciously similar to mine. Flyers for a pop-up restaurant using my name and my face appeared in neighborhoods I hadn't even stepped foot in, promising authentic home cooking, while dragging my reputation through grease-stained paper. I joked bitterly to Loretta that I ought to sue myself for copyright infringement, and she cackled so loud it almost healed me. But when the laughter settled, I still felt hollow, because deep down I knew whose hands were holding those stolen labels. It became impossible to ignore Malik's shadow over it all, the way his new friends strutted around flashing money they never worked for, bragging about deals that sounded suspiciously like stolen recipes, and how his smirk grew sharper every time I lost another opportunity. He didn't just want me off TV, he wanted me erased, my voice gone, my work swallowed by his schemes, as if silencing me made him more of a man. I lay awake some nights trying to convince myself I still loved him the same, that blood would always bind us. but the truth burned heavier in my chest with every passing day. Love cannot excuse sabotage, and respect cannot survive when it is ground into dust under your own child's heel. I told myself storms eventually pass, but this one only grew darker, and each time I tried to breathe, it felt like someone pressed their hand over my mouth, daring me to speak louder and risk choking. Yet even as I bent under the weight of it, I felt something stubborn rising in me. Because a woman who has spent decades making meals stretch out of scraps learns not just to endure, but to transform. And I sensed that the very lies meant to bury me might someday be the same fire that exposed him. I didn't know when the break would come, but I knew one thing for certain. The truth has a way of leaking out, like broth seeping through the cracks of a cracked pot, and sooner or later, someone would smell it. I had grown so used to doors slamming in my face that when the smallest crack of light appeared, I almost didn't believe it. And yet sometimes hope slips in through places no one expects, like a draft under the kitchen door that tells you a storm is breaking. It started with something so ordinary I nearly missed it. A phone bill lying open on the table, and my eyes catching a number I didn't recognize, stamped on the exact date I had been waiting for good news. At first, I thought it was just another wrong call, another mistake to shrug off. But the more I stared at those digits, the more my heart thudded against my ribs until I finally picked up the phone and dialed. On the other end was a calm, professional voice that made my throat tighten with both joy and fury, because she explained that her team had called me weeks ago to offer a chance at a screen test for a cooking show, but I had politely declined. The words cut like knives, because I knew exactly who had done the declining and whose mouth the lie had passed through, and yet at the same time, those words lifted me higher than I had been in years, because for the first time I had proof that the rejection was never about my talent. It was about sabotage. That single conversation shifted everything, turning my pain into fuel, my tears into fire. And for the first time in months, I felt the ember of possibility glow inside me. The producer's voice was warm, almost apologetic, and when she told me there might still be a chance if I could deliver a strong sample reel within 2 weeks, I pressed the phone so hard to my ear I thought I might leave a bruise, because those words weren't just an invitation, they were oxygen to a drowning woman. I sat in silence after we hung up, staring at the wall as if the paint itself was whispering, reminding me I wasn't crazy, I wasn't invisible. I hadn't wasted all those years at the table writing letters into the void. Malik hadn't stolen my dream, he had only delayed it, and knowing that gave me a strange kind of joy. The kind you feel when you realize the joke wasn't on you after all. I didn't let my anger show, not yet. I smiled when Malik walked through the kitchen, nodding at him as though nothing had changed. But inside, I was already reshaping my world, quietly planning each step I would take. Because if there is one thing life has taught me, it's that timing is everything, and just like a slow stew needs patience to develop flavor, revenge and justice both require the right moment to simmer before they boil over. And as I sat with that secret, clutching the tiny spark of hope, I knew this was only the beginning, because one chance was all I needed, and this time no one was going to hang up the phone for me. Once I knew the truth, it was as if the weight I had carried for years shifted from crushing me to pushing me forward, and the hopelessness that once made my hands shake now steadied them, guiding me toward a quiet plan I kept tucked close to my chest. I no longer cried at the table or begged God to explain why my dreams were denied, because now I understood they were not denied, only stolen, and stolen things can be taken back if you are careful enough. So I gathered every scrap of paper, every letter I had mailed, every rejection slip I had saved in old boxes, and I studied them like they were recipes, noticing the tiny changes, the missing paragraphs, the altered words that twisted my voice into something bland. The more I uncovered, the stronger my resolve grew, And instead of feeling ashamed, I began to smile because I realized I was holding the evidence of my own silencing. And evidence is a weapon sharper than a knife. I worked in silence, letting Malik believe I was beaten, nodding when he made his slick little jokes, acting as if I had accepted defeat, because a clever cook knows better than to lift the lid too early and let the steam escape. Inside, though, I was already plotting my next move, scribbling notes in a journal I hid under my flour sack, setting small deadlines, teaching myself that discipline could be the difference between another failure and a victory. I even laughed to myself sometimes, imagining that the same patience that let me wait for dough to rise was now teaching me how to wait for justice. And though it may sound strange, I found comfort in that rhythm because it reminded me that nothing worth savoring ever comes quickly. I reached out quietly to Loretta, my old friend with a sharp wit and a steady loyalty, and asked if she could help me record a new reel. She laughed so hard at the idea, told me she didn't know a camera from a casserole, but she agreed without hesitation, reminding me that friendship is another ingredient you can't measure but you always taste when it's there. Together we began to piece together what I would show, not just food but stories, not just recipes but history, the kind of truth no rumor could erase. And every time I rehearsed, speaking into the lens with a steady voice, I felt stronger than I had in years. Malik had stolen my first chance, but I was quietly cooking up a second, and this time the dish was going to be spiced with something far more powerful than cinnamon or nutmeg. It was going to be seasoned with defiance. By the end of that week, my plan was no longer just scraps of paper and hidden notes. It was a clear path, a vision I could almost taste, and every time Malik walked through the door with that careless swagger, I smiled to myself, because I knew he had no idea the game had already shifted. He thought I was broken, but I was only bending, waiting, preparing, and in that patience, there was strength he couldn't imagine. What he didn't know was that the clock had already started ticking, and the same kitchen he tried to turn into my prison was about to become the stage where I reclaimed my voice. I knew if I tried to work under my own roof the way I had before, every spoon would mysteriously go missing. Every bag of flour would suddenly run out, and every time I turned my back, there would be one more reason my project could not move forward. So I made the decision to take my kitchen elsewhere, to build a safe space where no one could tamper with my dream. The church annex became my refuge, its linoleum floors echoing under my shoes as I carried in my pots and pans, its plain white walls glowing under the borrowed lights we dragged out of the choir closet. And for the first time in months, I felt a quiet kind of freedom, the relief of knowing that when I set my ingredients down, they would still be there the next morning. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. And for once the air didn't taste like suspicion. It tasted like possibility. Loretta, bless her heart, showed up with a camera she barely knew how to turn on, her laugh booming as she fumbled with buttons, telling me that if things went wrong, we could always pass it off as artistic blur. I couldn't help but laugh with her, because after so many nights of swallowing bitterness, that laughter felt like oxygen, and it reminded me that even in the middle of sabotage and betrayal, joy has its place. We set up the camera on a shaky tripod, stacked hymn books underneath to keep it from tilting, and when that little red light blinked on, I felt my shoulders square, my voice steady, and suddenly I wasn't just a woman fighting rumors. I was a host, a storyteller, a cook who knew that every dish carried a piece of her soul. It felt awkward at first, but by the end of the first take, I found myself speaking with a confidence I hadn't tasted in years. I cooked like I was feeding not just the lens, but a whole audience of women who'd been told they weren't enough, seasoning my greens with patience, folding my cornbread batter with care, letting every movement tell a story. Loretta cracked jokes behind the camera, sometimes so loud they made me snort in the middle of a line, and instead of ruining the footage, it made it real, it made me human, and for once, I stopped worrying about perfection. I imagined women watching one day, nodding along, smiling at the way I tied my apron or chuckling when my spoon slipped. And I thought to myself that maybe my story wasn't just about food, maybe it was about proving that women like me, overlooked and underestimated, could still take center stage. The rumors outside the church walls still buzzed, but inside that annex, with Loretta laughing and my food sizzling, I felt untouchable. By the end of the week, we had hours of footage, far more than I needed, and when I packed everything into a neat little file ready to send off, my hands trembled not with fear, but with excitement. For the first time in a long time, I believed in myself more than I believed in the lies whispered about me, and I could almost hear the producer's voice again, promising that the door was still open. I carried the file home in silence, smiling at Malik when I passed him in the hallway, hiding the thrill that bubbled inside me, because I knew he had no idea the walls he had built around me were already crumbling. And yet deep in my chest, I sensed the shift, the warning that someone like him wouldn't take defeat quietly, that his smirk would not vanish without one last fight. And I braced myself, because the better I did, the harder his shadow would try to grow. I should have known that the moment I carved out a safe space for myself, the pressure would return twice as heavy, because people who thrive on control never sit back quietly when they feel it slipping through their fingers. It started with small disturbances, like strange knocks on the church annex door late at night when Loretta and I were cleaning up, or envelopes slipped under the threshold with no words inside, just grease stains that left our hands dirty. At first we laughed it off, saying maybe the church mice had gotten bold, but deep down I recognized the pattern. The same invisible hand that had been nudging me off balance for months was now pounding its fist harder, desperate to remind me it still had power. Soon the whispers escalated into threats, disguised at first as inspections and warnings, as if the very walls of my kitchen had turned into witnesses against me. A city inspector I had never met showed up with papers demanding to see permits I didn't even need, flipping through my drawers as if he were hunting for a reason to shut me down. And though his voice was polite, his eyes told me he wasn't there for the law. He was there for someone else. My neighbors started receiving anonymous notes about my illegal kitchen, and I found a crude message scratched onto the side of my car, the letters shaky, but clear enough to make me shiver when I read them. Humor slipped out of me in the darkest way, muttering to Loretta that at least whoever wrote it didn't have the nerve to spell check. And we both laughed, because sometimes laughter is the only way to steady a trembling heart. Malik never mentioned any of it, never admitted what was happening, but the satisfaction on his face each time another problem arose was all the confession I needed. He strutted through the house with new sneakers and gold chains. His friends piled into our living room as if they owned the place, and they looked at me with the kind of mocking smirks that told me they thought I had already lost. Every time I carried a grocery bag in, one of them would make a snide comment, as if I were nothing more than a tired old woman chasing a dream too big for her hands. And though my jaw clenched, I forced myself to keep silent, because I had learned patience was stronger than shouting. The reel was already on its way to the producer, and that thought alone was enough to quiet my anger, reminding me that while they wasted their time on threats, I was building something real. Still, their games left me uneasy, and when I walked into the annex one evening to find the back door slightly ajar, I froze, my stomach dropping as though the air itself had gone sour. Nothing was missing, nothing was broken, but the message was clear. They wanted me to know they could get in any time they pleased. I closed the door slowly, locked it tight, and told myself to breathe, but I couldn't shake the weight of it. I realized then that this was no longer just about gossip or sabotage. It was about intimidation, about fear being planted like weeds in my garden. And though my knees trembled, I promised myself I would not let fear take root, because my fight was bigger now, and if I gave up, they would own not just my kitchen, but my voice. The more I tried to focus on my work, the more the pieces of a darker puzzle began to fall into place. And what I thought was simply sabotage soon revealed itself to be something uglier, a whole operation hiding in plain sight and built on the very recipes that carried my family's history. It started when Loretta's nephew, a quiet boy who worked with numbers better than most people worked with words, offered to help me trace the strange flyers and fake menus that had been floating around. At first, I thought it was just petty theft, some desperate attempt to tarnish my name. But when he laid out the trail on paper, the truth hit me like hot oil splattering from a pan. There were pop-up kitchens running under my name, cash businesses tucked into corners of the city I hadn't stepped foot in for years, each one flashing my smile on laminated menus and promising authentic flavors, while funneling money through hands I recognized too well. Every recipe that was supposed to be my legacy had been stripped down, watered out, and sold for profit, the food tasting of greed instead of love. And the worst part was that people believed it, because my face was printed right there on the flyers. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity, to shout that if anyone really thought I made macaroni without seasoning, they deserved a refund. But the bitterness caught in my throat, because this wasn't just theft, it was identity robbery. It was my life being used as someone else's disguise. The more I dug, the clearer it became that Malik wasn't just a bystander enjoying my downfall, he was knee-deep in it, standing proudly at the center while his friends strutted around as if they had built something from scratch. The money they flaunted wasn't from hard work, it was from selling me, from putting my name on their mess and daring the world to call it legitimate. Even the officers who once laughed with me over pie slices now kept their distance, their silence a shield against a problem they didn't want to touch, and that silence spoke volumes about how deep this thing went. I thought of every time Malik had rolled his eyes when I worked late, every smirk when I opened another rejection letter, and I realized it had never been about protecting me from disappointment. It had always been about keeping me in the shadows while he stood in the light stolen from my fire. For a moment I felt crushed, smaller than I had ever felt, but then I remembered something my grandmother used to say, that lies are like smoke. They might cloud your eyes for a while, but they can never season the food, and sooner or later, the smell of truth breaks through. I folded the papers Loretta's nephew had laid out, tucked them into my purse like sacred scripture, and told myself that this was the ingredient I had been missing, the secret spice that would turn the whole story around. The men who thought they could use my face and silence my voice were about to learn what happens when a woman decides she's had enough. And as I walked home that night, I smiled, because for the first time I wasn't just reacting to their fire. I was preparing to light my own. I decided that if the men who stole my name were going to make money off my face, then I would make sure the light shone on everything they were hiding, and the best place for that light was where the whole country might see it. I called the producer back with a calm I didn't fully feel and proposed a segment that would not only celebrate my food, but also make my supply chain and documentation transparent to anyone who cared to look, because public scrutiny is the one seasoning crooks hate most. I reached quietly for help from places I usually never trusted for favors: a lawyer recommended by Loretta's cousin, a consumer affairs contact who owed her a small kindness, and even an old friend at a local TV station who said sometimes television will eat a scandal for breakfast if it smells like truth and tastes like justice. Putting the plan together felt oddly like setting a table for Sunday dinner. Every detail mattered, every dish had its place, and if one thing was missing, the whole spread would look sloppy. We agreed the pilot would include a simple, unavoidable piece: a QR code on screen that would lead viewers to scanned permits, receipts, and a chronological timeline of the pop-ups using my name, so anyone watching could see the paper trail for themselves. It was elegant in its simplicity and dangerous for those who thought anonymity would protect them. Working with the producer and the show's legal team, we framed the segment as a tribute to honest home cooks and small business ethics, not just a witch hunt, because television loves a story with heart and a morale, and because it made it harder for anyone to cry foul when the goal was framed as righting a wrong. I felt the old nervousness in my stomach the way you feel before you put a pan in the oven, but it was tempered with focus. This was no longer about proving myself to strangers. It was about showing the world who had been taking advantage of my labor and my name, and I intended to let that truth simmer until it could not be ignored. There were risks. Anyone who has ever put a family recipe into a public space knows how exposing that feels, and I knew going public would mean open conflict with the people who had been profiting from my silence. Still, I kept thinking of the truth laid out on paper like a clean tablecloth, and of all the women who might see it and breathe easier, knowing someone had pushed back. I rehearsed my lines until they felt like an old hymn, and I made sure to tell stories between instructions, so the segment would be more than a file dump. It would be a life, a history, a reason to care. Loretta kept reminding me to smile for the camera, saying the audience eats confidence like dessert, and I promised myself that if this worked, the shame they had tried to paste on me would instead stick to them. When we scheduled the taping, I felt a strange calm that made my hands steady as I prepped the food. The paperwork was scanned and uploaded to a secure link. The producer had legal eyes all over it, and I watched the material take shape like a recipe finally getting its proper ending. I kept the plan close and my voice low when I told a few trusted friends, because the fewer ears the enemies had, the better, and I knew the moment would need to be exact. As I walked to the studio the morning of the shoot carrying a pan of still warm cornbread, I felt both terrified and oddly buoyant, like someone who's finally decided to sing after swallowing a lifetime of silence. And deep down, I suspected that when the QR code flashed across the screen and the paper trail lit up, the men who traded off my name would realize their fortune was built on sand, and sand washes away in daylight. On the morning of the taping, I woke earlier than usual, my heart beating steady but heavy, as if my body knew this was the day all the hidden work, all the late nights and quiet prayers would finally step into the light. Carrying trays of greens, cornbread batter, and lemon pound cake, I walked into the studio feeling both like an ordinary woman and someone about to shift her entire life. And as the lights flicked on and the cameras turned my way, I realized this was no longer just about food. It was about reclaiming my name in front of anyone who ever doubted me. The air smelled of butter and smoke, and with every stir of the pot, I told stories of my grandmother's hands, of neighbors gathering on porches, of love simmered into Sunday meals, until I could almost feel the viewers leaning closer to their screens, tasting the truth in every word. When the moment came, the producer gave a subtle nod, and the QR code appeared at the bottom of the screen, unassuming and ordinary to the casual viewer. But to those who scanned it, a door opened onto a world of stolen identities and dirty money. The link showed, side by side, my clean, carefully documented kitchen and the shadow business that had been trading off my name, with receipts, dates, and menus lined up like dominoes ready to fall. The phones in the control room lit up almost immediately, not just with compliments about the food, but with questions, outrage, and the kind of attention that makes lawyers and investigators perk up. And I felt the energy shift in the room, as if the lies that had blanketed me for so long had just caught fire. Back at home, Malik's phone rang over and over again, and though I wasn't there to see it, I knew by the silence that followed what must have happened, because sometimes justice doesn't need to shout. It only needs to shine a light bright enough that the truth can't be hidden. In that studio, as I plated the cornbread and wiped my hands on a towel, I felt something in me settle, a weight I had carried for years finally lifting, because the evidence wasn't just in my hands anymore. It was out there for the world to see, and no amount of smirks or sabotage could pull it back into the dark. As the cameras cut and the crew began to applaud, I stood taller than I had in decades, realizing that my fight was no longer a private battle, but a public reckoning. And though fear still sat in my stomach, it was no longer the fear of being silenced. It was the fear of what would come next when people who thrived in the shadows were dragged into the daylight. And yet beneath that fear was something stronger, something that tasted like triumph. The knowledge that the show had become my weapon, the kitchen, my battlefield, and that day I had struck the first real blow. By sundown, the cooking pilot had done more than introduce my food. It had dragged an entire hidden business into daylight, and the pop-up kitchens using my name shut down almost overnight. Men who once laughed behind my back now scrambled to distance themselves, their fake menus pulled down, their pockets suddenly empty. Even the officers who had looked away for months could no longer ignore what had become public, because hiding now would only expose them too. Malik, who once strutted with his friends like he owned the block, stood stripped of the pride he had wrapped himself in, his crew scattering as soon as the money trail went cold. The swagger he wore like armor dissolved, leaving only silence and avoidance. And for the first time, I saw not a son protecting his future, but a man who had built it on lies and watched it crumble in a single afternoon. It was painful to admit, but justice doesn't ask if it will break your heart. It simply comes. The calls that had once never been returned now poured in, from producers eager to work with me, neighbors offering apologies, even church ladies who had gossiped now whispering their support as if they had always believed. Loretta laughed until she cried, saying she'd never seen a scam collapse so fast, and this time I laughed with her, because finally the joke wasn't on me. Still, victory carried an ache, because though I had cleared my name, I had lost Malik, the boy I once rocked to sleep, now just a man who chose the wrong side. But I told myself some losses are the price of truth, and I could live without his approval, but never again without my own voice. And now the whole world had heard it. In the weeks that followed, the storm finally passed, leaving behind not destruction but a strange calm, like the silence after a long hymn when the last note still lingers in the air. My kitchen no longer felt like a prison, but a place of strength again, its walls carrying the rhythm of new beginnings, and each pot of greens or tray of cornbread. I pulled from the oven reminded me that I had not been erased. I had only been delayed. The producers confirmed a full season, my recipes reaching audiences far beyond my block, and for the first time I felt like the world was tasting the truth I had carried for decades. The neighbors who once whispered now stopped by with open smiles, sometimes carrying store-bought pies as peace offerings, and though I accepted them with grace, I couldn't help but laugh to myself that the same mouths once accused me of stealing recipes. Loretta kept me grounded, telling me not to let the fame go to my head, joking that if I ever hired a makeup artist, she wanted her own too, and together we found a rhythm that made the whole ordeal feel like a distant memory. Even the local officers nodded again when passing me on the street, as if pretending they hadn't turned their backs when I needed them most. And though I didn't forget, I let it go, because carrying bitterness is like over-salting a dish. It ruins the flavor for everyone. Malik stayed away, and the empty chair at my table cut me sharper than any gossip ever had. But I learned to live with it, because sometimes blood ties cannot survive betrayal. I prayed for him, not with the desperate pleas of a mother trying to pull her son back, but with the calm resignation of a woman who knows everyone must face the consequences of their own choices. Losing him hurt, but finding myself again healed something deeper, and I realized that my story had never been about his approval, it had been about reclaiming my own. So, the moral is simple, sisters. Never let anyone steal your voice, not even the ones you love, because silence may keep peace for a season, but truth always feeds the soul. My journey proved that even the deepest betrayal cannot bury a woman who decides to rise. And when the world finally heard me, it wasn't just my recipes they tasted, it was my resilience. And as I stood in that kitchen, apron tied and oven warm, I smiled knowing that karma is real. that good outlasts greed, and that no matter how many times you are pushed down, life will serve justice hotter than any dish you could ever cook. And if this story touched you even a little, don't just scroll away. Hit that like, drop a comment, and subscribe. Because every bit of your support reminds me I'm not alone in this fight, and it gives me the strength to keep sharing more stories that matter.